We've shown that effect in a whole lot of other different domains as well. We've looked at morality. If you present the same information in a format that's difficult to read, either because the font that you've chosen is complex or because you put the font against a background that isn't very highly contrasting or contrastive against that font, you find that people think that that moral transgression they're reading is worse. By struggling to read the transgression, they basically assume that the transgression is worse. Somehow that ends up affecting or colouring how they feel about the transgression. If it's much easier to process, if they can read it more easily, they tend to feel not quite as negative about the transgression. So this fluency principle has a whole lot of direct influences. When something is fluent, we seem to like it more, we like people more, we feel more positively about them, we judge a moral transgression more positively, we like financial stocks more or think they'll be more valuable. We've shown the same effect, and other researchers have shown the same effect in other domains as well. So that's the very beginning of fluency research. It's pretty simple stuff. But we delved a little bit deeper, and what we've been interested in for maybe the last 4 or 5 years is looking at whether you're not just changing the direct relationship between what it feels like to process something and then the judgments you form, but also whether that experience of processing it either fluently or disfluently, with ease or with difficulty, ends up changing the cognitive operations that you perform on the target. So what I mean by that is when something is difficult, that should act as a metacognitive alarm or a signal that you don't understand it as well as you perhaps should. And so we've given people a number of different tasks. There's a famous task called the cognitive reflection test, and this test has 3 different questions, and each of the questions lures you into giving the wrong response because the intuitive response is actually incorrect. So an example of this is when you add the cost of a bat and a ball together, the sum of those two is worth $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So it's a very simple question. Anyone with basic arithmetic skills can answer it. And what happens is, for some reason, the first and intuitive response is that, well, I guess the bat must be $1, the ball must be 10 cents, that adds to $1.10, that seems about right. But of course the difference between $1 and 10 cents is 90 cents, not $1. So the correct answer is that the bat is worth $1.05, the ball is worth 5 cents. They add to $1.10 and the difference between them is $1. And people generally struggle with these questions. They're lured in, they give their intuitive response, and they're incorrect. But if you present the questions in a font that's a little bit more difficult to read, we found that you can increase their accuracy pretty dramatically. They make fewer of those intuitive responses. They take the time to reconsider their initial responses. They assume that the task is more difficult. They have a bit less confidence in their initial response, and so they tend to do a little bit better at the task. The same is true when you ask them to complete syllogism questions, logical syllogisms. Any questions that ask you to think more deeply about a particular topic, where thinking more deeply will lead you to the right answer more often. We've shown that with disfluency people are more likely to do that. We've shown the same effect in a number of other domains as well. When you look at persuasion, people can either process the information very deeply. So if you give them a review of a new MP3 player or a new phone, they can either process that very superficially by just looking at which brand of phone we're talking about, or MP3 player, and some other superficial cues that they might get. For example, is the person who's telling them this information, does this person seem like they know what they're talking about? Or they can process the content of the review, which takes a little bit more effort. And we've shown again, when the review is a little bit more disfluent, people pay more attention to the content. They're willing to take the time to process it more deeply before they form a judgment. So you can influence the way people process information by presenting it in a disfluent format, making it more difficult to read or process. We've shown the same thing with a different dimension. So another thing that happens when something is disfluent is it seems psychologically more remote from you. It feels farther away from you. So if you imagine trying to remember something, if it feels more difficult to remember, you'll assume that it happened longer ago, that it's further from where you are today. The same thing is true if you're looking at something and you're trying to judge its physical distance. If it's fuzzy or difficult to perceive, you might assume that it's farther away. And so we've shown that people make these distance judgments based on how easy it is to process the information, and that they also, when they see something as farther away, they tend to focus on its more global aspects. So if you ask someone written more disfluently to describe New York City, they'll give a much more global abstract description of New York City. So instead of talking about things like the boroughs and how many people there are, they might say something like, it's a playground for the rich and famous, something much more abstract that focuses on a higher or global level rather than focusing on the narrow minutiae or the concrete aspects of the city. Another thing I've been looking at is how people become energized to act in a particular way, either to do something good for themselves like losing weight or starting an exercise program, or even buying something. What makes them want to buy something? And I think the first step in all of that is always going to be imagination and thinking about what the consequences of doing that action will be. So you either imagine losing weight and how nice that'll be, or you imagine being more fit and how nice that'll be, or you imagine being healthier, or you imagine how happy you'll be when you buy something, whether or not that's true. And we've shown that disfluency leads you to think more deeply, as I mentioned earlier, that it forms this cognitive roadblock, and then you think more deeply and you work through the information more comprehensively. But the other thing it does is it allows you to depart more from reality, from the reality you're at now. So if I'm thinking about whether I want to start a new exercise program and I want to know what it's going to be like to feel more fit, that's a departure from the current reality. We've shown some evidence that when people experience disfluency, when you give the prompt in a font, and you say to them, think about what it'd be like to be fit and to have done a lot of exercise. If you give that prompt in a font that's very difficult to read, in a disfluent font, people tend to think longer about the task, they think more deeply about it, they depart more from reality, and then later on they actually say that they're going to be more willing to do this sort of exercise, and so they become more committed. We started to get some data from a program as well to see whether phrasing the whole experience disfluently will lead them to be more committed, to think more deeply and more fully about what it'll be like to reach their goal. And so I think that's another social implication, that disfluency, by leading you to think more deeply and by enriching your fantasies about what it'll be like to accomplish what it is you're trying to accomplish, might encourage you to make these steps more energetically and to be better prepared for them.